When Huawei released the Huawei Mate 40 Pro 2 years ago, they were still very fresh into the software ban of the US and had some issues with Android only. But the hardware was still their own. The Kirin processor, 5G supported, and top-of-the-notch camera hardware. Now the story is a bit different, because now with the Mate 50 Pro, Huawei is not only software banned but also hardware banned, so they don't have the newest best 5G chip inside, not their own chips anymore, and they're not able to use top-of-the-notch camera sensors. So how does the Mate 50 Pro compete against the Mate 40 Pro? Let's find out and let's get started. So let's take a look at the camera specifications of the Mate 40 Pro against the Mate 50 Pro. So 50 megapixel main sensor, though we have a larger Mate sensor on the Mate 40 Pro than on the Mate 50 Pro. We have 13 megapixel, 12 megapixel actually, periscope zoom 5 times on the Mate 40 Pro, 3.5 times 64 megapixel sensor on the Mate 50 Pro. And on the Mate 40 Pro we have a 20 megapixel, very large, relatively large as the main sensor on the Mate 50 ultra wide angle, and we have a 13 megapixel, a little bit smaller sensor on the Mate 50 Pro. On the front, both feature a 13 megapixel front facing camera, both have 3D face unlock, but we have a notch on the Mate 50 Pro where we have a pill cutout on the Mate 40 Pro. So I think we start up with the front-facing video. And this is now the Mate 40 Pro's front-facing camera, 13 megapixels, and it has basically the same tag as the Mate 50 Pro. So we have the 0.8 times magnification here. I can go to the white one, which looks like this. It's a little bit less stable, I would say, but we can also go to 1 time, which looks like this in terms of crop in. Is a little bit more cropped in than the 0.8 times, which I would prefer for vlogging. Sadly, it doesn't have autofocus, but because of the 3D face unlock features here, the artificial blur that you can get is pretty good for photos. But what do you think about vlogging here? 4K 30 frames per second, so you can go up to 4K 60 frames per second on this cam. What do you think about this one here? And this is now the Mate 50 Pro's front-facing video. You can see that, yeah, the colors are almost the same. We have nice, good HDR on this one here. 0.8 time magnification as well. I can go to wide, which is a lot wider, but also I think a little bit more stable than on the Mate 40 Pro still, though it's still, yeah, a little bit more shaky than, like, for example, 1 time, which is now 1 time, which is, I think, a little bit more zoomed in, I think, than on the Mate 40 Pro. But in general, I think the face detection and the vlogging capabilities here, 4K 30, are basically the same, and there's not much that has improved from the Mate 50 Pro coming from the Mate 40 Pro. And what do you think about stabilization, colors, and so on the Mate 50 Pro? And now this is a recording with the main video camera of the Mate 40 Pro, the so-called Cine lens, which is actually also the ultra wide angle, which is not actually really ultra wide, it's just a little bit wider than the main lens. So this has a very large sensor as well, which gives you a nice background blur, and it's ideal for vlogging. I like the Cine lens idea from Huawei, and I'm really angry a bit that they abandoned it, because I think it is a very, very cool idea, and this is the quality that you can expect at this Cine lens. But we also want to switch to the main lens, which is a 1/1.28 inch sized sensor, very large sensor even for today's standards still, and larger than on the Mate 50 Pro. So let me go and switch to the now we have the roughly the 1 time lens here, and this gives you even more background blur. which is pretty nice indeed, and a very cinematic kind of video thanks to the very large sensor. Also in low light it performs very good. Stabilization is good. We have 4K 30 frames per second that I'm recording here right now, but it can go up to 4K 60 frames per second, and on all those lenses it can record this, which is pretty nice indeed. And then of course we have the periscope zoom, and I want to zoom on something here. There's a ship passing by very slowly, and yeah, hopefully the focus is also catching it. Let's zoom in. So we are at 5 times now, 6 times there. It switched the lens, and I can go up to 15 times. I think it's focusing on the foreground. Let's try to focus on the background. There we go. On the ship itself, this is 15 times at 4K 30. I think it looks pretty good. And this is now the main lens on the Mate 50 Pro. I think it's using f2 right now as aperture, because this is one of the big features of the Mate 50 Pro, the variable aperture. But I think f2 is okay, though it could have a bit more background blur if I switch to f1.4, which I can show you right now. Here we have now f1.4 on the main lens of the Mate 50 Pro. It gives you a nice background blur. It can definitely compete against the Mate 40 Pro's larger sensor but smaller aperture combination. It can even compete, I think, with the type 1-inch sized sensors that we have on other smartphones, because they have usually a smaller aperture. What do you think about this one here with the biggest aperture opening? But also we want to compare it to the ultra-wide angle from the Mate 40 Pro. So let's go to the ultra-wide angle. This is now the ultra-wide angle. You can see it's much wider than on the Mate 40 Pro. And this is one of the advantages if you have lots and lots of crowd or want to show a little bit more around you, you can do this. Though this one doesn't have any background blur and is a very small sensor in comparison to the one on the Mate 40 Pro. Let's check out the zoom lens. This is a 3.5 times zoom lens, and yeah, let's go in, zoom in. This is now 1 time, switch lenses. We have now 3 times, 4 times it switched lenses, and we can go up to 15 times, which reached now, and it's pretty stable, a little more stable than on the Mate 40 Pro, I think. And also very clear here. So the 64 megapixel sensor here gives you nice zoom capabilities and still details in video. Even though I saw better already, this is pretty cool, isn't it? We start off with the low light photos. On the left always the Mate 40 Pro, on the right always the Mate 50 Pro. We have a brighter exposure on the Mate 40 Pro that we can see on first glance. In terms of contrast, there's a bit more contrast on the Mate 50 Pro. That tends to look a little bit more detailed, especially look at these lines here, look at the details here on the balcony. That is a bit wishy-washy on the Mate 40 Pro and a bit sharper on the Mate 50 Pro. When we take a look at the ultra-wide angle, we can directly see the difference in terms of field of view, 18mm versus 13mm, 13mm the wider view on the Mate 50 Pro. When it comes to detail levels, of course the 12 megapixels cannot compete against the almost 20 megapixels of the Mate 40 Pro, though both are not very detailed here, but we get a bit of more resolution on the Mate 40 Pro and a bit more details. When it comes to the zoom shots, this is now 3.5 times zoom. The Mate 50 Pro does a better job. It's its native zoom range, and you can see that there's much more noise on the Mate 40 Pro because it's cropping into the main sensor. And in terms of colors, I think also the Mate 50 Pro nails it here a bit better. When it comes to the main shot, we can see both are doing a bit of a good job in terms of colors on this sunset, and also I think the detail level is on par, but we have a bit of a brighter exposure on the Mate 40 Pro again, and a bit of more muted colors where we have a bit more punchy colors, more contrast on the Mate 50 Pro. When it comes to the dark areas here, you can see the Mate 50 Pro retains a nice sharpness where the Mate 40 Pro is falling apart a bit. We have a lot of noise that is like denoised, and some details that are still going missing here in the dark areas. Even though the Mate 40 Pro is brightening things up a little bit, we can clearly see that the Mate 40 Pro struggles in this low light situation. When it comes to this shot, we see better HDR handling on the Mate 40 Pro, where we can clearly see a little bit more on this top of this lamp, where the Mate 50 Pro is overexposed and I think also has the wrong color here. When it comes to close-up shots, the Mate 50 Pro offers a super macro mode where the Mate 40 Pro just has a normal macro mode that automatically utilizes the ultra-wide angle when you're shooting automatic mode, and you can get much closer with the Mate 50 Pro, which also struggles a bit less with focusing. And when I zoom in, you can clearly see much more details. The Mate 40 Pro struggles a bit more, and then we have overexposure and we have less detailed shots. So macro shots definitely go to the Mate 50 Pro. Also in this shot, where both failed to focus on the front flower, but they managed to focus on the back flower. We can clearly see both doing a good job, but I think I like the Mate 50 Pro a bit better because it has a bit more detail. When it comes to the main shots, we don't see much of a difference, just a bit of more punchy colors here in the green grass, a bit more over sharpening on the Mate 50 Pro, where it is a little bit less sharp on the Mate 40 Pro. In terms of detail levels, there is a bit of better HDR handling in the sky, I think, on the Mate 50 Pro, and a bit of more contrast added to the Mate 50 Pro. Overall, when it comes to the sides here, on this side, we can see that the Mate 40 Pro has a bit of more noise, but also a bit more details, where it's a bit of wishy-washy on the Mate 50 Pro. When it comes to close-up shots with the main lens, how close can we get? We can get a bit closer with the Mate 40 Pro, and it has nice background blur thanks to its very large sensor, but also struggles a little bit, as you can see here, with the HDR stitching. The Mate 50 Pro can also have a very nice background blur, as nice as the Mate 50 Pro. Also has a bit of problems with the stitching here, but this one has been taken with the manual mode or Pro mode with the largest aperture f1.4, where it gets a very nice background blur. I can also do it in automatic mode, where I don't have such a blurry photo, but I think it was using f1.8 here, and we still get a nice background blur and even sharper image with much more sharpened details on this flower, even a little bit better than on the Mate 40 Pro, though you can see how much details the Mate 40 Pro has, which is pretty interesting here in this leaf, for example, which is completely gone here, but therefore we have more details here on this leaf and also on this leaf, as you can see here. So both very good main sensors that don't struggle much. Also in HDR, they're doing a pretty good job. I think slightly better on the Mate 50 Pro, because it has the ability, just like in this shot, to close the aperture down a little bit. So we have a different kind of pattern here of the sun that is not so overblowing the highlights, just like on the Mate 40 Pro. Again, more punchy colors on the Mate 50 Pro, less punch on the Mate 40 Pro. And we can see here also in terms of punchiness and sharpness, again a bit of over sharpening on the Mate 50 Pro with a bit more punchy colors and more contrast. In general, both doing a great job with slightly, again, look at here, slightly more HDR on the Mate 50 Pro. A puddle shot that I cannot resist, again a bit more punchy colors, a bit more sharpened up colors on the Mate 50 Pro against the Mate 40 Pro. I think the colors, the Mate 50 Pro nails it a bit better, but the Mate 40 Pro looks also very, very pleasant. Again, a bit of better HDR handling here on the Mate 50 Pro. Selfies is a clear win for the Mate 50 Pro, but not so clear as you might think. They're very close together. We have a bit of more contrast here on the handrail, for example, and more sharpening on the background, which is a bit weird, where the Mate 50 Pro leaves it out of focus and also not adding so much contrast. Better HDR handling here on the background for sure on the Mate 50 Pro. When it comes to detail levels on my face, you can clearly see both on par, not much of a difference. And the same you can see here, both struggle a little bit with the sun and lens flare effect. I think the Mate 50 Pro a bit more than the Mate 40 Pro, but the Mate 40 Pro overblows the sky almost completely, where the Mate 50 Pro only has like a slightly tiny bit there that is a bit overblown. We have a bit more yellowish kind of hue on the Mate 50 Pro and a bit whiter on the Mate 40 Pro. In terms of detail level, again, basically on par, not much of a difference. Ultra wide angle, again the Mate 40 Pro a bit closed up, 20 megapixels, more details for sure, because it's a little bit less wide, and we can see more details on the balcony, for example. Look at the green grass, more punchy on the Mate 50 Pro than on the Mate 40 Pro, but the Mate 40 Pro definitely more detailed here for sure. But we have much more in shot on the Mate 40 Pro, where yeah, here it struggles to find this because it's just not so wide. And the same goes for this shot. More punchy colors again on the Mate 50 Pro, wider field of view, and a bit more details on the Mate 40 Pro for sure, because it is not so wide. Zoom shots, this is 5x zoom, native zoom range for the Mate 40 Pro. The Mate 40 Pro wins against the Mate 50 Pro, which already looks very processed. But when it comes to 10x zoom, the Mate 50 Pro fights back and is much better than the very wishy-washy Mate 40 Pro. As you can see here, not only the text, but all the rest of the details is much better on the Mate 50 Pro, even though it is using heavily processing on this one. And you can clearly see it also in the 3.5x native zoom range, which is much better on the Mate 50 Pro than on the Mate 40 Pro, which only crops into the main sensor. And again, another 10x zoom shot to show you, yes, there's more details on the Mate 50 Pro than on the Mate 40 Pro, even though the Mate 40 Pro is cropping in from a 5x native zoom range. This one is clear. And it's also clear to me that they are much closer at 5x zoom, which is a native zoom for the Mate 40 Pro, and it's a non-native one on the Mate 50 Pro. But when it comes to 3.5x, which is a native zoom for the Mate 50 Pro, the Mate 50 Pro is much better than the Mate 40 Pro's cropped in. So much more details on the Mate 50 Pro, again a bit over sharpened for sure, but so much more details, and yeah, a lot better than the Mate 40 Pro. So zoom overall, I would give it to the Mate 50 Pro, even though the 5x the Mate 40 Pro wins. 10x zoom, again, you can clearly see who's sitting there in the boat, and it's like a bit of a painting on the Mate 40 Pro. This is everything for the photos. What do you think about this one here?
So what do you think about the Mate 40 Pro against the Mate 50 Pro? Is it really a big upgrade from the Mate 40 Pro to the Mate 50 Pro? I think in certain aspects definitely. So the zoom lens, 10x zoom for example, the computational photography that Huawei did here is pretty outstanding. I also think that Huawei on the Mate 50 Pro, yeah, a little bit improved the color science there in comparison to the Leica colors that we had on the Mate 40 Pro. The ultra wide angle is definitely ultra wide and has better macro capabilities. The only issue that I see here is, yeah, we don't have a cine lens anymore on the Mate 50 Pro, and this was a really cool thing to do. What we have, however, is the variable aperture. That might be a very cool gimmick, but also very usable and useful for videography and photography. All in all, I think the better sensor on the main is still on the Mate 40 Pro, though the Mate 50 Pro comes very close. So is it a big upgrade, just like the Mate 40 Pro was a big upgrade to the Mate 30 Pro? Not so much. It's a smaller step for sure, even though we have 2 years now past. That shows that Huawei is struggling a bit, but it also shows how good they are still in managing their technology for getting a device out that is now 2 years old and can still compete with the latest and greatest. What do you think? Write it down in the comment section. That's everything for this short little video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Until the next time. Bye.